He told me he was starting over. New city, new life, new everything. He said it with this quiet kind of certainty that I didn't fully understand yet. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have guessed standing in that parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon, was that starting over included me. Like this story. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a new episode. We post every week. I want to tell you about the day I met his Maddox Riley. And he walked into the property management office where I worked in Evansville, Indiana, on a Wednesday in late October carrying a folder of documents, a cup of gas station coffee, and the quiet, careful energy of someone who had recently had their whole life reorganized without asking for it. I noticed him the way you notice weather changing, not with alarm, just with attention. My name is Rowan Mita. I'm 38 years old. I was born in Evansville, Indiana, raised 2 blocks from the Ohio River, went to college at the University of Southern Indiana. Came back home after graduation because my mother needed help, and I never quite found a reason to leave again. That is not a sad story. I want to be clear about that. I built a life I genuinely liked. I had good friends, a job that used my brain, and a small brick house on Bellamede Avenue with a lemon tree and a pot on the back porch that had no business surviving Indiana winters, but somehow did. Every single year. I also had, for about 4 years, a relationship with a man named Derek that ended quietly, and without much drama 18 months before Maddox walked into my office. Derek and I had cared about each other in the way that people do when they make good companions, but not great partners. We separated with honesty and mutual respect, and we are still genuinely friends. I say all of that because context matters. I was not a man in the middle of chaos when this story began. I was a man who was fine, fully functional, mostly content, a little bit lonely in the middle of the night kind of way that you don't really admit to anyone, not even yourself. So, Maddox Riley. He came in to inquire about renting a 2-bedroom unit in the Pigeon Creek Commons development on the east side of town. He had a folder. He had good paperwork. He was organized in that specific way, that people become organized after a period of disorder, where every piece of paper is precisely where it should be, because chaos recently taught them the cost of carelessness. I found that out later. In that first meeting, I just thought he was a neat person. He was probably 41, 42. Dark hair with gray coming in at the temples, which I have always found deeply unfair and also appealing. He had a slight build, medium height, the kind of quiet physical presence that doesn't demand a room but holds it anyway. He wore a navy fleece vest over a plaid flannel shirt, which is standard Evansville autumn attire, and he had a small scar above his left eyebrow that I noticed and then tried not to keep noticing. I need something available by the 1st, he said. I have a daughter, she's 7. She'll be with me about half the time once things are settled legally. I need 2 bedrooms. I nodded. I asked standard questions. Income verification, rental history, preferred lease length. He answered everything clearly and without elaboration, which was professional and fine. People don't owe you their story when they're filling out a rental application. But then at the end, when I was making copies of his documents, he said quietly, almost to himself, I'm starting over. I just want you to know I'm good for it. I've never missed rent in my life. I looked up from the copy machine. I believe you, I said, and I did. There was something in how he said it that wasn't a plea. It was more like a statement of character offered freely, the way a person tells you something true about themselves when they are trying to establish themselves in a new place. He signed the lease 3 days later. He moved in the first weekend of November. I didn't see him again for almost 2 weeks. Evansville is not a small town, but it's not a big one either. 120,000 people, give or take. The Ohio River runs along the south edge of downtown. The neighborhoods spread out in rings from there, older brick homes close to the river, newer subdivisions further north. There is a gentleness to the city that people from other places don't expect. Residents tend to greet each other. Strangers hold doors. The pace is deliberate in a way that takes getting used to if you're coming from somewhere faster, but once you adjust, it feels like exhaling. I managed about 40 units across 3 small residential developments for a woman named Gloria. No, wait, her name was Sylvia. No, her name was Millicent. Yes, Millicent Ackhaffer. She was 63, sharp as a new knife, and believed deeply in maintaining good properties and treating renters like adults. I had worked for her for 9 years. My job involved lease management, maintenance coordination, tenant communication, and occasional property walkthroughs. I was essentially the person who kept things running. It was unglamorous and satisfying in the way that most genuinely useful work is. The second time I saw Maddox was a Saturday in mid-November. I was doing a routine check of the exterior lighting at Pigeon Creek Commons before the really cold weather set in. I came around the north corner of Building C and found him sitting on his small concrete patio in a camp chair, wearing a thick coat, drinking coffee from a travel mug, and staring at the strip of sky visible between 2 apartment buildings. He looked up and didn't seem startled. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. "Sorry to bother you, just checking the light fixtures." "You're not bothering me," he said. "You're my landlord." "Property manager," I corrected automatically. He almost smiled. "Right, property manager." I went about my business with the light fixture. It was a loose connection, not a big deal, I made a note. But when I turned to go, something made me stop. Maybe it was the camp chair. Maybe it was the stillness of him sitting there in the November cold like he had nowhere better to be and no particular feelings about it. "You settling in okay?" I asked. He considered the question more carefully than I expected. "Yeah," he said finally. "It's different." I waited to see if he'd say more. He didn't, but he also didn't seem to want me to leave. So I said, "Different how?" And he said, "Quiet." I understood what he meant without needing explanation. When you go from a full house to a half-empty apartment, the quiet is its own presence. It fills the corners and sits on the furniture and follows you from room to room. It is not simply the absence of noise. It is the presence of change. "It gets easier to locate yourself in the quiet," I said. "After a while." He looked at me, just looked like he was deciding whether or not that was true. Then he nodded once slowly. "Yeah," he said, "I'm counting on that." I went home that evening and made dinner and did not think about Maddox Riley, or I tried not to. There is something uncomfortable about being drawn to someone who is clearly in the middle of restructuring themselves. It felt like the wrong moment. Like walking into a room while someone is still moving the furniture. But December came and the lights on Bellamede Avenue went up, and I found myself driving past Pigeon Creek Commons more often than necessary. Not slowly or creepily. I was managing the property. There was legitimate professional reason. But if I am being honest with myself, and this is the kind of story where honesty is the whole point, I was aware of which window was his. And once on a Tuesday evening in early December, I saw the warm square of light in his window and a small shape moving past it that was too short to be him. His daughter, I realized. She was there for the week. And something in my chest did a thing it had no business doing, something warm and a little aching, because there was a child in that apartment making it a home. And there was a man inside trying to learn how to build something from the pieces he had left. I did not knock on his door that night. That would have been inappropriate. But I thought about him on the drive home, and I thought about him while I watered the lemon tree, and I thought about him while I fell asleep. And that was the beginning of a problem I hadn't anticipated. The third time I saw him was not at the property. It was at the Haney's Corner Arts District Winter Market on a Saturday. Evansville has this neighborhood on the near north side. Older homes, mature trees, a kind of comfortable urban scruffiness. And once a month through the winter, they run an indoor market in the old community hall on Alvord Boulevard. Local makers, food vendors, a few artists. I go most months because there's a woman there who makes exceptional hot sauce, and I have a problem I've accepted. I was standing in line for the hot sauce when I heard a small voice say, very seriously, "Daddy, that man is buying all the hot sauce." I turned. Maddox was standing 2 people behind me, holding the hand of a little girl who was wearing a bright orange coat and had her father's dark hair and was looking at me with the frank, unpolitical curiosity of a 7-year-old. "I'm not buying all of it," I said to her, "just 3 bottles. She considered this. "That's a lot." "Her name is Bianca," Maddox said, and he was trying not to smile. "She's at the stage where she narrates everything." "It's a good stage," I said. And Bianca, apparently satisfied with our exchange, turned her attention to a display of knitted animals nearby and said, "Daddy, look," and pulled him toward them. He followed her but glanced back at me over his shoulder. Rowan Wright from the management office. Yeah, I said. Rowan Mita. Maddox, he said, as if I didn't know. Good to see you. You too. He disappeared into the market with his daughter. I bought my hot sauce. I stood in the middle of the old community hall with 3 bottles of habanero mango sauce in a paper bag and felt something shift. Not dramatically, not like a thunderclap. More like when you adjust the picture on the wall, and suddenly everything in the room looks better without you being able to say exactly why. I ran into them again 20 minutes later at the cider booth. Bianca was explaining to the cider vendor at great length why she preferred apple juice to apple cider because cider, in her expert 7-year-old opinion, smelled like something had gone wrong with the apple. Maddox was paying for a cup of cider with the expression of a man who has learned not to apologize for his child's opinions, because the child's opinions are, honestly, not wrong. I ordered a cup. I stood next to him. She makes a fair point about the smell, I said quietly. I'm not going to tell her that, he said, but yes. She does. We stood there drinking cider while Bianca examined a display of handmade ornaments with tremendous concentration. And Maddox said, without looking at me, thank you. For what you said on the patio about locating yourself in the quiet. I looked at him. Did it help? Not immediately, he said, but it gave me something to work toward. He paused. I've been a married person for 11 years, half my adult life. The quiet felt like failure for a while. I didn't say it wasn't, that wasn't my place. And now, I asked, he finally looked at me. And now it just feels like where I am. That's progress, I thought, but didn't say. That is real, genuine progress. We stood there a little while longer than made sense for 2 near strangers at a cider booth. Bianca came back and showed us an ornament shaped like a hedgehog and asked if hedgehogs could be Christmas animals. If you say so, Maddox told her. I say so, she said, and put it back very carefully because she had apparently already decided she wasn't going to ask him to buy it, which struck me as a remarkably self-contained act for someone who was 7. We said goodbye, he walked away. Bianca waved at me over her shoulder with her free hand, the one that wasn't in Maddox's. I drove home. I sat down on my couch. And I thought, I need to be very careful here, because he was a tenant in a property I managed, because he was in the middle of something large and painful and reorganizing. Because getting this wrong, moving too fast, misreading something, could cause genuine harm to someone who was already navigating enough. And there was something else I couldn't name yet, something just below the surface of all the careful logical thinking. Something that felt a lot like the particular anticipation of knowing that a story is starting, before you know what kind of story it is. I did not act on any of it. I went to bed. I was responsible. But then January came, and the pipes in Building C froze during the cold snap that dropped Evansville into single digits for 5 days, and Maddox was the tenant who called first. And he called at 6:30 in the morning in a voice that was calm and clear and not panicked, and said, I think we have a problem on the north side of the building, and I was already in my car by 6:45. And when I got there, he was standing at the utility access door in his coat with a flashlight, having already located the affected section of pipe, because Maddox Riley, it turned out, was the kind of person who found the problem and stood next to it so the person who could fix it could find it easily. I coordinated the plumber. I managed the other affected units. It took most of the day. Around 2 in the afternoon, Maddox brought me a cup of coffee from inside his unit without asking if I wanted one, just handed it to me, said, You look like you need this, and went back inside. The coffee was made correctly, not too strong, not weak, just right. I stood in the cold hallway drinking it and thought, oh no, not a dramatic oh no. More of a quiet, settled, clear-eyed oh no that acknowledged what was happening in my chest and recognized that I was going to have to make some decisions. The plumber finished. The heat came back. I knocked on Maddox's door to let him know everything was resolved. He opened it and said, Come in, I made soup. Not as a question, as a statement. I said, I really shouldn't. I have 3 other calls to make. He said, Make them from in here. It's warmer and the soup is good. And because both of those things were true and I was cold and a little worn out, and because, honestly, because I wanted to, I said yes. The apartment was simple and clean. He hadn't overdecorated. A few things on the wall, some books on a shelf. A child's drawing tacked up near the kitchen with a felt tip pen label that said Dada's house in Bianca's careful, uneven printing. That drawing undid something in me. I looked away from it quickly. The soup was a white bean and kale situation. It was, in fact, good. We ate at his small kitchen table and talked about practical things at first. The building, the winter, his job, which was, he told me, something in occupational safety consulting. He visited industrial sites and assessed hazard compliance. He had done it for 12 years. He was good at it. He traveled occasionally, but not constantly. Then we talked about less practical things. He asked how long I'd been in Evansville, and I told him my whole history. Born here, left for 4 years for school, came back. He asked if I'd wanted to come back or if it had just happened. I thought about it honestly before I answered. Both, I said. My mother needed help, and that was the reason I came back. But once I was here, I realized I'd been looking for a reason. The city suited me. I just needed permission to choose it. He nodded like that made sense to him. He told me he was from Louisville originally. That he'd moved to Evansville 8 years ago for his wife's job, a woman named Noel. He said her name without bitterness or performance, just clearly, the way you say a name that belongs to a chapter of your life that you are still in the process of respectfully closing. They had been married 11 years, and the marriage had ended not because either of them was a bad person, but because they had become over time. People who needed different things, and had been honest enough with each other to finally say so. She's a good mother, he said. She's a good person, I want to be clear about that. It sounds like you handled it as well as it can be handled, I said. We tried, he said. He looked at his soup. Bianca is doing okay, that's what matters. We have a good agreement. She sees both of us regularly. He stopped. She's a remarkable kid. I know every parent says that. But she really is. She makes a compelling argument about cider, I offered. He laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded. And something in his face changed when he laughed, opened up. He looked younger and more like himself, like whoever he was before the divorce started the process of untangling him from the person the divorce had briefly made him. Yeah, he said. She definitely does. We talked for 2 hours, which was far longer than I intended. I made my other calls from his kitchen table while he washed the soup bowls. And by the time I left, the sun was already going down, and the temperature had dropped again, and I sat in my car in the parking lot for a minute before I started it. I was in trouble, not bad trouble, but real trouble. I drove home thinking about the drawing on his wall, Dad's house in uneven 7-year-old printing. I thought about the way he'd handed me the coffee, the way he'd laughed. I thought, I cannot do anything about this until I'm no longer his landlord. And then I thought, but what if I talk to Millicent? And then I thought, no, not yet, not until I know what this is, not until I know it's real, so I waited, responsibly, like an adult. Except that I started stopping by the winter market on the 3rd Saturday of every month, which I hadn't done before. And I started taking a slightly longer route on the way to Pigeon Creek Commons that went down Alvord Boulevard, which was perfectly legitimate. And I found reasons to answer Maddox's maintenance questions myself rather than just forwarding them to our contractor, which I will admit was less legitimate, but also made me feel useful. And then in February he texted me. Not a maintenance question, a regular text. He said, do you know anyone in town who does decent tutoring for 2nd graders? Bianca is ahead in reading but struggling with math, and I want to get her some support. It was a completely reasonable question to ask your property manager, who is also a local person who knows people. I found the name of a tutoring service and texted it back. He thanked me. I said no problem. 3 days later he texted again, she loves it. Wanted to tell you, thank you. It was not a romantic text. It was a text from a parent who was grateful for helpful information. But I read it 4 times, and somewhere in those 4 times I accepted what was happening. I was falling for Maddox Riley, carefully, slowly, without any certainty that it went both ways. Without any plan for what to do about it, but falling, nonetheless, in the way that feels less like drama and more like gravity. Like something that was always going to happen once the conditions were right. I just didn't know yet what would happen next, and I didn't know if he felt any of it. And I didn't know if I would ever be brave enough to find out. But the way he'd handed me that coffee was still somewhere in my muscle memory, that easy, matter-of-fact gesture of someone who noticed what you needed before you asked. And the drawing on the wall. Dad's house, I think that's when I understood, not just that I was falling for him, but that what I was falling for wasn't just him, it was the whole of it. The man who was starting over, piece by piece, putting himself back together with intention and quiet pride. The man who made soup when someone was cold. The man whose 7-year-old had opinions about cider and Christmas hedgehogs and said them without apology. I was falling for the whole story. And I had no idea, not the faintest idea, that I was already part of it. March in Evansville is unreliable weather. One week it's almost 50 degrees, and the crocuses are making their tentative appearance in the front beds of the older houses on the east side. And the next week there's sleet, and everyone acts mildly betrayed, as if this doesn't happen every year. I have lived here long enough to find it charming rather than frustrating. March is just honest about the fact that change is not a straight line. That's what I was thinking about, actually, the morning that everything shifted. The non-straight line of change. I was in the management office doing quarterly reviews of lease renewals. Maddox's initial lease was a 6-month term, which meant it was coming up for renewal or reassessment in May. That was a practical thought, a professional thought. But it led me to another thought, which was less practical and more honest. I had been managing his tenancy for 5 months. In those 5 months we had, through proximity and cold pipes and winter markets and text messages about math tutoring, become something that I couldn't quite name. Not friends exactly, though it was friendly. Not strangers, something in between that had its own warmth and its own weight. And the problem was, as long as I was managing his lease, there was a line I was not willing to cross. Not because of a written rule, Millicent didn't have a policy against property managers developing relationships with tenants, but because of my own standard. A tenant is in a position of some dependency. They need things from the person who manages their home. That's not a power imbalance to take advantage of, even inadvertently, even with good intentions. So I had 2 choices. Continue as I was, which was honest but increasingly uncomfortable, or talk to Millicent. I talked to Millicent. I will not reproduce the entire conversation, because it was somewhat mortifying. But the summary is this. I told her I had developed what I thought might be a personal interest in a tenant, and I wanted to formally request that she reassign his lease to our assistant manager, a capable and responsible woman named Doreen, so that I was no longer in a position of professional responsibility over his housing. Millicent looked at me over her reading glasses for a long moment. Then she said, "You're telling me this because you want to ask him out." "I'm telling you this because it's the right process," I said. "Those can both be true," she said. They were both true. She reassigned the lease to Doreen on a Monday. On Wednesday, I drove to Pigeon Creek Commons after work, not as the property manager, and knocked on Maddox's door. He opened it. He looked surprised but not alarmed. He was in jeans and a gray Henley and his reading glasses, and he had been doing something at the small desk near the window, papers spread out, laptop open. "Hey," he said, "everything okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Everything's fine. Doreen is going to be your contact for the building going forward. She's handling your lease renewal." "I wanted to let you know in person." He took that in. "Okay," he said. "Can I ask why?" And I thought about how to say it. I had practiced in the car. But now, standing in his doorway with the March evening cold behind me and the warm light of his apartment in front, all my prepared sentences went away. "Because I wanted to ask if you'd have dinner with me," I said, "and I thought I should sort out the professional part first." He was very still for a moment. His expression was unreadable, which was, I discovered, one of the more genuinely terrifying things in adult life. Not because it was hostile, because it was careful. And careful meant he was taking it seriously, weighing it, which was appropriate but which also made my heart do several things in rapid succession. Then he said, "How long have you been thinking about this?" "A while," I said honestly. "How long is a while?" "Probably since January," I said. "The soup, I think." Something moved in his face. "The soup," he repeated. "You handed me coffee before I asked for it," I said. "That was actually the beginning, but the soup confirmed it." He was quiet for another moment. And then he said, "I need to tell you something." My stomach tightened. Here it was. Here was the part where he explained that he wasn't interested that way, that he was newly divorced and not ready, that he was straight. That any of a dozen things were true that would close this door gently, but definitively. "I'm gay," he said. "I know it sounds strange to say that like it's new information about myself. I'm 42 years old. But Noel was the only serious relationship I'd had as an adult, and when it ended, I started therapy. Which is how I finally understood some things about myself that I'd been not quite understanding for a long time. I waited. Because there was clearly more. I've known for about 4 months," he said, "and I haven't done anything with it. I've just been sitting with it. Figuring out what it means for who I'm going to be next." I looked at him steadily. "And what does it mean?" "It means," he said slowly, "that I noticed you too. And I kept not knowing what to do about it. There it was, not a dramatic revelation, just a quiet exchange of truths between two adults standing in a doorway in early March. But I felt it all the way through, warm and clean and significant, the way things feel when they are genuinely true. "So," I said, "dinner." "Yeah," he said. "Dinner, we went the following Saturday. We went to a restaurant on Riverside Drive, the kind of place with good lighting and unhurried service and food that is serious without being pretentious. A locally owned Italian place called Pharaoh's Table that had been there since Evansville's downtown riverfront started its slow, steady comeback in the late 90s. I'd been there dozens of times. It felt different with him across the table. Dinner was 3 hours long. Not because we were performing for each other or filling silences with noise, but because the conversation moved easily from one thing to the next, from the small to the large, from the practical to the tender, and each topic led naturally into another. We talked about his therapy, which he brought up openly and without embarrassment. We talked about my relationship with Derek, which I explained honestly, including the fact that it had been good and had simply run its natural length. We talked about his marriage the same way, with the same honesty and the same respect for everyone involved. We talked about Bianca. He talked about her the way people talk about the things they love most deeply, when they finally trust someone enough to do it without guarding themselves. He told me about the hedgehog ornament, which she had received for Christmas from her grandparents because Maddox had mentioned it, and which now sat on her nightstand at both houses. He told me about her reading, how she was already on chapter books, how she'd recently become interested in a series about a girl who solves mysteries with her grandmother. He told me about her laugh, which was apparently enormous and completely unself-conscious, and how it was his favorite sound. I told him about the lemon tree, about my mother, about the feeling of choosing Evansville rather than just staying in it, about what I wanted, which I hadn't been asked to articulate in a while. I said I wanted a life that was full rather than busy. I said I wanted to wake up somewhere that felt genuinely like mine. I said I was tired of the lonely at 3 a.m. feeling, that I'd grown so accustomed to that I'd stopped noticing it, until I noticed it all at once sitting at his kitchen table in January. He listened to all of it. He listened the way people listen when they actually want to know, not waiting for their turn to talk. "I'm not in a simple place," he said at one point honestly. "I want you to know that going in. I'm figuring out a lot of things simultaneously. Being a single parent, being gay, being newly single after a long marriage. I'm not a disaster, but I'm a work in progress." "I know," I said. "I've been watching you work, and you still want to have dinner." "I already did have dinner," I said. "I'd like to do it again." He smiled, the real one, the one that opened his face up. We walked along the Evansville riverfront after dinner. It was cold, still properly cold for March, and the Ohio River was high and dark and moving, and the lights of the new infrastructure on the west side reflected in it. We walked without a plan for where we were going, just the direction of the river, and at some point he put his hands in his coat pockets and said, "This is nice." "Yeah," I said. "I didn't think it would feel this easy," he said. "What, being here with you like this?" I looked at him sideways. "Were you worried it wouldn't?" "I didn't know what to expect," he said. "I haven't been on a first date since I was 30. I wasn't sure I remembered how." "You're doing fine," I said. "So are you," he said, and then he laughed at himself for saying it, and I laughed too, and we walked a little further down the riverfront in the cold March night. He didn't take my hand that night. I didn't reach for his. We were being careful with each other in the way that matters, giving things room to develop rather than rushing them because they felt good. But when we got back to his car, which was parked in the lot near the old Lloyd Expressway overpass, he stopped and turned and said, Thank you for rearranging the professional part first. Of course, I said. I mean it, he said. It was the right way to do it. It made me trust you more. That landed somewhere important. We made plans for the following weekend before we said goodnight. April came and the weather made up its mind, and the crocuses stopped being tentative. I had Maddox over for dinner at my house on Bellamede Avenue on a Sunday. I made pasta, which I am genuinely good at, and we sat at my kitchen table and talked until it was later than it should have been on a school night. And when he left, he stood at my front door for a moment and said, I want to tell you something. Okay, I said. I told my therapist about you, he said, about dinner, about all of this. What did she say? She said I sounded like myself, he said. She said she could tell the difference. I looked at him. What does that mean, sounding like yourself? It means that for about 2 years before and after the divorce, I was performing, he said. I was managing, being careful and capable and holding everything together, which was necessary. But it wasn't really me. It was me trying to be enough. He paused. When I talked about you, apparently I just sounded like a person talking about something good that was happening. She noticed the difference. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said what was true, which was, I'm glad. Me too, he said. He went home. I stood at my front window for a while after his taillights disappeared down Bellamede Avenue. The street was quiet and yellow-lit. The lemon tree in its pot was still alive, because of course it was. I thought about what he'd said about his therapist noticing the difference in him. I thought about it not with vanity, but with something more solemn. Because that was the weight of this, wasn't it? It wasn't just a new relationship. For Maddox, it was part of something larger. A reckoning with who he was and who he was going to be. And I was walking into that story at a significant moment, which meant I needed to carry it carefully. I was prepared to do that. I wanted to do that. But I was also aware that wanting something is not the same as being ready for it, and I needed to stay attentive to the difference. In late April, we had our first complicated moment. Bianca was with Maddox for the week, and they were in the parking lot of his building when I drove past on my way to a different property. This was still my professional territory, just not his unit specifically. I stopped and rolled down the window, said hello. Bianca looked at me with her direct gaze and said, You're the hot sauce man from the market. I am, I said. Do you live here? She asked. No, I said. I work near here. She considered that. Then she said, Are you my dad's friend? I looked at Maddox, who was watching me with a careful, neutral expression that I understood. This was his call. I was not going to step on it. We're getting to know each other, I said, which was true. She seemed satisfied with this, and moved on to informing her father that she needed to go inside because her show was starting, and they went upstairs. Maddox texted me later that evening, sorry if that was awkward. I texted back, it wasn't. You're navigating it well. He texted, she's perceptive, she'll figure it out. I texted, I know, that's fine. A pause, then, I want to tell her at some point, when it's right. She's going to need to understand that this is who I am now. I want to be honest with her. I said, that sounds like exactly the right approach. He said, I'm scared. I said, that makes sense. Also, you're a good dad. She'll follow your lead. He said, how do you know? I said, the hedgehog on the nightstand. A long pause. Then just, yeah. The following weekend was the one that I think of as the before and after point of this whole story. Not because anything dramatic happened, because something quiet happened that was more lasting than drama. It was a Saturday afternoon. Bianca was back at Knowles for the weekend. Maddox had texted in the morning asking if I wanted to walk the Greenway, the trail that runs along the Ohio River on the Evansville side, which is a good walk when the weather cooperates, and April in the Midwest is finally deciding to cooperate. We met at the parking area near Sunrise Park and walked south along the river. The Ohio was lower than it had been in March, and the trees along the bank were just coming into that particular green that only happens for about 3 weeks in spring before it deepens and settles into summer. The light was the kind of clear pale gold that makes everything look washed and specific. We walked and talked and eventually ran out of conversation and just walked, which is its own kind of intimacy. Walking alongside someone in comfortable quiet is one of the small measures of whether something is real. After a while, on a long, quiet stretch of the path where the river was visible through the trees and there was no one else around, Maddox reached over and took my hand. Quietly, without announcement. just reached over and held it. We walked like that for a while, neither of us said anything. And then he said, "This is the first time I've done this." Held someone's hand on a trail, held a man's hand, he said, simply, quietly, without drama. I looked at him and he was looking at the river, and there was something in his expression that was not complicated at all. It was just clear. Like someone who has opened a window that has been painted shut for a long time and felt the air come in. "How does it feel?" I asked. "Right," he said. We kept walking. The river moved alongside us. A heron lifted from the bank and crossed the water slowly, all patience and wingspan, and disappeared into the trees on the other side. I thought, this is the moment I'll remember. Not a kiss, not a declaration. This. A hand in mine on a path by the Ohio River on a Saturday in April, and a man who was learning who he was walking next to me like he'd been doing it forever. I held his hand back firmly so he'd know I was there. We walked all the way to the southern terminus of the path and back. It was almost 4 miles. By the time we got back to the parking area, the shadows were longer and the gold light had gone to copper. We stood by our cars and he said, "Come to dinner tomorrow." "I'm cooking. What are you making?" I asked. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'll figure it out." I smiled. "Yeah," I said. "You usually do." He looked at me for a moment, something warm and steady in his eyes, and then he said, "You know what's strange?" "What?" "You make starting over feel less like a loss." I didn't answer right away because the right answer wasn't a quick one. "That's not something I did," I said finally. "That's something you did, you just let me watch." He thought about that, then nodded once like he was deciding to believe it. "Okay," he said. "Tomorrow, dinner. I'll bring wine," I said. I drove home down Alvord Boulevard and turned onto Bellamede and pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a minute in the soft April evening with the window down. The lemon tree was visible through the back window of the house, alive as always against all reasonable expectation. I thought, something is beginning. And then, about 3 weeks later, something else happened that I hadn't expected, that changed the pace of everything, and that made me understand for the first time that we were not, as I had assumed, working with unlimited time. Maddox called me on a Tuesday evening in mid-May with a voice that was careful in the specific way that careful means something is wrong. "My mother," he said. "She's in the hospital in Louisville. It's her heart, it's not immediately critical, but it's serious. I need to go." "Of course," I said. "Go, how long do you think?" "I don't know," he said. "A week at minimum, maybe more. She's 74 and she lives alone. There are decisions to make." "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to tell you." He paused. I heard him exhale. "Actually," he said, "that's not true. I called because I wanted to hear your voice." The simplicity of that. "I'm here," I said. He left the next morning. Bianca stayed with Noel during that stretch, which he'd arranged quickly, and Noel was, he told me afterward, entirely gracious about it. He drove to Louisville, which is about 2.5 hours from Evansville, and spent 10 days there managing the medical situation, the paperwork, the decisions about whether his mother, whose name was Beverly. No, that's taken. His mother, whose name was Arlene, would need to be in a care facility long-term. He called me most evenings, sometimes briefly just to touch base, sometimes for an hour. Those phone calls were, I think, the thing that made us, because there was nothing to perform on the phone. No ambience, no first-date energy, no mutual awareness of how we looked to each other. Just his voice and mine, trading the ordinary details of each day, the hard logistics of dealing with a parent's health, the quiet updates of my ordinary week at the management office. The small things. He told me about his mother, what she was like, sharp-tongued and funny and intensely proud. He told me she had called his divorce pragmatic and had meant it as a compliment. He told me she had cried when he told her he was gay, not with disappointment, but with something that looked more like relief on his behalf, and said, "I always knew you were working too hard at being fine." I told him about my mother, who had died 4 years ago, and who I still thought about when the lemon tree bloomed. He listened to all of it. We talked about the future in those phone calls too, gently and without pressure. He said he was thinking about whether staying in Evansville made sense long-term, now that his reason for coming here in the first place, Noel's job, was no longer his reason. He wanted to stay close to Bianca's life, which was anchored in Evansville, so he wasn't going anywhere. But he was thinking about what kind of life he wanted to build here. What permanence looked like. I did not say I could be part of that, I thought it. But I didn't say it because that was his question to answer. He came back to Evansville after 10 days. His mother's situation was settled. She was moving to a good assisted living facility in the East Louisville area, close to her sister, which was, Maddox said, actually the best possible outcome for her. She was resistant to the idea and would probably be annoyed about it for 6 months, and then announce that she'd been right to make the move all along. He came back on a Friday evening. I had texted to say welcome back. He texted back, "Are you home tonight?" I said yes. 40 minutes later, he knocked on my door. He looked a little worn. Not broken, just rinsed out in the way of someone who has spent 10 days being responsible for other people, and is only now, in the first moment that's truly his, feeling the weight of it. He came in. I made tea. We sat at my kitchen table and talked for an hour, and then he was quiet and I was quiet, and then he said, "I kept thinking about this kitchen. While you were in Louisville, when things were hard," he said. "I kept thinking about your kitchen and the pasta and how easy it was to just be here." I looked at him across the table. "I want this," he said, "whatever this is becoming." "I want it." "Me too," I said without hesitation. He looked up. "I know it's not simple, the Bianca piece, the figuring out who I am piece." "Maddox," I said gently, "I know that. I'm not asking for simple, I'm asking for this." Something eased in him, visibly, like a door finally settling into its frame. "Okay," he said. "Okay." We sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, not doing anything particularly notable. He had his hands around his tea mug. The kitchen light was on, and the back window was dark, and the lemon tree was a shape in the glass. It was ordinary and specific, and exactly where I wanted to be. I want to tell you about the Saturday in June that Maddox took me to meet Bianca properly for the first time. Not as the hot sauce man from the market or a vague presence she'd seen in a parking lot, but as someone who mattered to her father. They'd had a conversation, Maddox and Bianca, that I heard about afterward. He'd sat with her and explained, carefully and honestly, in language a 7-year-old could understand, that sometimes daddies can love a man the way they loved mommy, and that he was gay. Which was just a word that meant he was someone who could have a boyfriend rather than a girlfriend. He told me she had listened very seriously, and then asked if this meant he was going to get another cat. Because she had seen a conversation about change, and decided it went in a direction she was interested in. He said, "Maybe not a cat, but there is someone I'd like you to meet." She had said, "The hot sauce man." He had said, "His name is Rowan." She had said, "Does he still buy a lot of hot sauce?" He had said, "Probably." She had said, "Okay." So that was the established baseline as we arrived at the park off Weinbach Avenue on a warm Saturday morning in June. Bianca was on the swings. She watched us approach with the same frank, unpolitical scrutiny she had deployed at the winter market. "Hi," she said. "Hi, Bianca," I said. "Did you bring hot sauce?" "Not today," I said. She considered this. "That's okay," she said. "Push me." So I pushed her on the swings. Maddox sat on the bench nearby, not interfering, just present, watching with an expression I will not try to describe because I'm not sure I have the words for it. Something between relief and awe. Something that looked like a person watching his life arrange itself into the shape it was always supposed to be. Bianca swung and talked. She talked a lot, rapidly and with great confidence, about the mystery series she was reading, about her best friend at school whose name was Penny, about the hedgehog ornament which she had brought from her mom's house to her dad's house because she decided it belonged there right now. She asked me what I did for work, and when I explained property management, she said, very seriously, "So you're like the person who makes sure houses work?" "More or less," I said. "That's important," she said, "because if houses don't work, nothing works." "She's right," I called over to Maddox. "She usually is," he said. Bianca swung for a while, and then asked if we could get ice cream, and Maddox said yes, and we went to the small ice cream stand on the edge of the park that sold soft serve in flavors I'd forgotten. Existed, like blue raspberry, and something called birthday cake that Bianca selected with zero hesitation and great conviction. We sat on a picnic table in the June sun and ate our ice cream, and Bianca talked, and Maddox, and I talked, and somewhere in the middle of it, completely naturally. Bianca moved from sitting across from us to sitting next to me, which I noticed and said nothing about. On the way back to the car, she walked between us and reached up without apparent thought and held both our hands. Maddox and I both looked at each other over the top of her head. It was a small moment. It was an enormous moment, both at the same time. In August, Maddox and I had our first real disagreement. I want to include this because love stories that leave out friction aren't true. And I want this to be true. It was about the pace. He had been thinking about looking for a house, something more permanent, somewhere Bianca could have a bedroom that felt like hers, a yard, some roots. He'd mentioned a neighborhood on the north side, a quiet block of bungalows near Jacobsville, and I had made a comment, an offhand comment that came out wrong, about whether he was ready to commit to a permanent address. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "What does that mean?" I tried to clarify. It came out worse. He said, "I feel like you're suggesting I'm not capable of making decisions yet. Like you're waiting for me to finish recovering before you take me seriously." That landed like a stone, because he was right that I'd said something wrong. And he was right that there was something in me, well-intentioned but condescending, that had been slightly holding back from fully committing to our future because I was still beneath the conscious level, treating him as someone mid-recovery rather than someone who was well. I said so directly. I said, "You're right. I think I was doing that without realizing it. I was still treating this like something delicate rather than something real. And that was unfair to you." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "it was." "I'm sorry," I said. "Thank you for saying that," he said. We didn't talk for the rest of that drive. But it was not a cold silence. It was the silence of two people who have said what needed to be said and are now sitting with it. He found the house. 3 bedrooms, a small yard with a persimmon tree, a covered porch, a block and a half from an elementary school. He asked me to come see it before he decided, not because he needed my permission, because he wanted to share it. I stood on the porch of that house on a September afternoon and looked out at the street, the mature oaks, the light coming through them in September's particular slant. And I thought about what it would mean. Not for me specifically, for him, for Bianca. "It's the right house," I said. He looked at me. Yeah, I said. "The porch is exactly right. Bianca can grow up on this porch." He looked at the porch too for a long moment. "I want you here," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Not to move in, not yet. That's a separate conversation for a different time. But I want you to know that when I picture this house, you're in the picture." "I know," I said quietly. "Do you?" he said. "Because I want to make sure, because you're not a chapter in my starting over story, Rowan. You're where the story goes." There it is. That was the line. The one that I carry with me. I looked at him standing on that porch with the September light on him and the persimmon tree in the yard behind him, and I thought, this is real. This is actually fully real. "Okay," I said. "Okay?" he repeated. "Okay," I said. "I'm in the picture." He moved into the house in October. Exactly 1 year after he walked into my office with his folder of documents and his gas station coffee and his quiet statement that he was starting over. Bianca's bedroom had a window that overlooked the persimmon tree. She picked out orange curtains, which seemed right. She put the hedgehog ornament on her windowsill so it could see the tree. She told Maddox, very seriously, that the room was good, which was the highest available rating in her 7, almost 8-year-old system of evaluation. I helped them move. I drove a truck rented from the place on Morgan Avenue. I carried boxes and assembled furniture and was present for the full, sweaty, complicated, joyful process of a family moving into a new home. Late in the afternoon, after the big pieces were done and Bianca was in her room arranging her books with tremendous methodical care, Maddox and I stood in his new kitchen with 2 cans of lemonade from the gas station around the corner because we hadn't yet unpacked any real glasses. He looked at the kitchen, at the stove, the window over the sink, the particular afternoon light coming through it. "This is mine," he said, quietly, not with surprise exactly, more with the recognition of something finally true. "Yeah," I said. "Ours," he corrected, and then he caught himself. I know what you mean," I said. We clinked our lemonade cans together. It was a completely ridiculous and entirely right gesture. "I need to tell you something," I said. "Okay." "That night last November," I said, When I drove past the building and saw the light in your window, your daughter was there. I could see the small shadow, and I thought about you in there trying to build something from what you had left. And I fell a little bit then. He looked at me. Before the soup, I said. Before any of it, what made you stop? He asked. From doing anything about it sooner? You were my tenant, I said. And you were someone in the middle of something. I didn't want to step into that without permission. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said. You keep thanking me for waiting, I said. Because it meant you saw me clearly, he said. Not as a project or a damaged thing. You waited until I was just a person and then you knocked on the door. That is exactly what it was. You were never damaged, I said. You were just mid-process. He nodded slowly. Then he reached over and took my hand. Just like on the Greenway Trail in April. Quietly, without announcement. Like it was the most natural thing. Come over for dinner Thursday, he said. I'll actually have dishes unpacked by then. What are you making? I asked. Soup, probably, he said. I smiled. Perfect. The winter came again. I celebrated Thanksgiving with Maddox and with Bianca, and with Noelle and Noelle's mother and Maddox's sister who drove in from Owensboro, which sounds complicated, and on paper it was, but in practice it was the particular warmth of people who have chosen to remain in community for the sake of a child they all love. There was no performance, no tension worth noting. There was a table full of people who were doing their best. Bianca sat next to me and at some point showed me that she'd brought a tiny hedgehog figurine to the table in her cardigan pocket. Just because, she said. I asked Maddox about it later. He said she'd started doing that, taking it places. He thought she liked the continuity of it. The thing that was always there. She can be a little literal about symbols, he said. I think she's brilliant, I said. Don't tell her that, he said. She already knows. In December, the winter market opened again at the community hall on Alvord Boulevard. We went together, the three of us, on a Saturday. Bianca made a beeline for the cider booth and delivered her annual critique to an entirely new vendor who was, somehow, equally charmed by it. Maddox stood beside me. I was holding a bag with 3 bottles of hot sauce in it. Look at us, he said. Back where we started. We're not back where we started, I said. We're standing in the same place with more information. He thought about that. Yeah, he said. That's better. We watched Bianca explain something very important to the cider vendor about the smell of fermentation and how, in her opinion, it was not something apples should aspire to. The vendor was nodding very seriously. She's going to change the cider industry, I said. Or she'll end up in consumer advocacy, Maddox said. Either way, I think she'll be fine. I looked at him. He was looking at his daughter with the expression I'd first seen on that park bench in June. The one I now recognized as the look of someone who has found his way back to the truest version of himself and is living in it. I thought about the year. About all of it. The parking lot, the frozen pipes, the soup, the river in April with a hand in mine, the phone calls from Louisville, the house with the persimmon tree, the hedgehog on the windowsill. I thought about that first night driving down Belmead Avenue, thinking about the warm square of his apartment window. He had said he was starting over. He hadn't known, and neither had I, that starting over has a direction, that it points somewhere, that sometimes, if you're paying attention and you move carefully and you are willing to wait for the right moment and knock on the door with honesty instead of strategy, starting over points you right toward the person who was going to be part of it all along. I didn't plan to be part of his new beginning, but here I am. On a Saturday in December with hot sauce in a paper bag, standing next to a man who handed me coffee before I asked and made soup when I was cold and held my hand on a river path like he'd been doing it forever, watching his remarkable daughter make a very compelling argument about fermentation and understanding with quiet, steady certainty that I am exactly where I belong. Some things don't announce themselves. They just arrive. And then if you're wise enough to recognize them, you stay.